Hey guys, Lou Perez here with We the Internet TV. We are doing another live stream. I'm really excited about this one. Hopefully, this time around we will not have any more technical difficulties. Right now everyone's like, oh no, what's going to fall on me? Trust me, you guys will be okay. I'm really excited to have the panel that I was able to put together. To my right, I have comedian, friend, confidant, Boris Khaykin. We have Angela Nagle. She's the author of Kill All Normies. I'm sorry, my all sounded weird. It's a really good book. Don't let the way I said it ruin it. To my left, Jesse Singal. He's a contributing writer to New York Magazine. And to his left, we have Anthony Fisher, who is a producer on the Fifth Column podcast, as well as the politics editor for The Insider. And I brought all these guys together because I wanted to talk about how narrative shapes politics. And when we were going back and forth, and Jesse was like, well, we got to talk about online drama. So I decided to bring one of the kings of online drama on. So we're going to kick things off by talking about that. And Jesse, why don't you bring us into the war room and what would you've experienced online, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think Angela's probably... Yeah. She's the queen of it, if I'm a kid.
So much so
King and queen are both here.
Well, you're not on Twitter anymore, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I'm the de facto despot. Yeah, I mean, I've just been thinking a lot lately about, you know, 3 of us are journalists, 4 of us are journalists, and we spend a lot of time online, a lot of time on social media, and I think I was always a little bit skeptical of claims that it was really doing that much shaping of narratives or the way people talk about stuff. I thought that was a little technophobic, Luddite stuff. But the more time I spend on there, the more I realize that it shapes how journalists view the world. It shapes what stories we cover. It shapes how we talk about stuff. And, there's a pattern now where when there's an outrage story or an emotionally arresting story, the Smollett story is a great example of this. There's the version of how it's covered and talked about online you see, of how sort of elite journalist types talk about it publicly. And then there's a huge amount of back channel chatter that's much more nuanced, much more complicated. So yeah, I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, is like how to bridge those two worlds. Because I don't think it's in that many people's interest that only one version of stories gets told publicly, while a lot of people who have more nuanced and sometimes more informed views on that story are chatting about it, in the background.
Mm-hmm. Was that your experience too?
Yeah, I was just thinking earlier today, this moment where, you always think you've reached a peak, but then it keeps going in terms of these strange dynamics that happen online that are tapping into some kind of psychological forces we don't quite understand, that sweep everyone up in whatever the scandal of the day is. It might be something that actually isn't materially very important, but it's symbolic, or it in some way taps into something that's kind of hard to put your finger on. It has this like emotional pull, and people, it becomes a scandal online, regardless of how important it might actually be. But I was thinking, it reminds me an awful lot of the way that it felt around the British tabloids before they had their News of the World scandal. Because at the time, everyone kind of knew there's something kind of morally wrong, and there's something quite horrible about these very humiliating stories about, at that time it was about celebrities, so it wasn't maybe quite as political, but everyone knew there's something kind of wrong about reading, the intimate details of like a embarrassing date or whatever it might be about a celebrity in the past. But it wasn't until the News of the World scandal kind of broke that people looked at themselves in the mirror in some way as an audience and realized that they were engaged in something quite horrible.
And what was that controversy?
Well, basically the tabloids, in this kind of desperate search to find the most humiliating, awful thing about celebrities and so on, they ended up, phone tapping people and going through people's garbage and just really kind of harassing families. There was one case where it was like the family of a girl who had been abducted and stuff like that. So, but the important thing is that they were feeding this desire that they,
the public wanted to read it.
The public wanted to read it, and so you look at it and you know that it's something wrong that you're participating in this, but you keep reading it. So how do you stop it is kind of what I'm thinking
Well, it's almost
about.
like Twitter has giving us like sort of like a direct access to like the first thought someone has. So there's like no longer a filter. So it's in a way it is sort of like kind of getting very intimate into, you know, these fresh ideas when they haven't been given, you know, total time, enough time to bloom into an actual strong argument or something like that. Because I know like I know that I'll tweet stuff out and in like a second before I'm like I shouldn't do, and then boom I do it. It's like my body's already made that choice. And were you gonna say something?
No. That kind of reminds me of. I remember reading about how there was if you guys remember, there was like a pastor who was talking about burning the Quran in America a while ago. And I remember reading about how a bunch of different journalistic organizations vowed that they weren't going to write about him because they knew that it was going to spark violence. And basically all it took was like one blogger who was like, screw it, I'm going to write about it because we should write about it. And then that kind of opened the bottleneck for everybody else. Because at that point, it's like, well, if one person is going to cover it, we're not going to be the ones that nobody's going to read it. So it's like a lowest common denominator that like either, it feels more cultural almost for all of society than it is for journalists. Because if one person's doing it, then it's like everybody might as well jump aboard or else they lose income, basically.
Well, when you're bringing up, you know, back channel discussions that are a lot more nuanced, how do we get to the point where there are, you know, certain narratives that are okay to fit to print, and then others that are like, oh, I need to not talk about this out loud?
I don't think there are that many subjects where things have gotten that bad yet.
Okay.
I mean, I'm thinking of Angela's article about open borders. And she basically argued against open borders, making pretty standard left arguments. She, you know,
and we'll get into that definitely.
Yeah, but I mean, that's an example of like, that was published in a major publication, and other major publications, you know, might argue otherwise, but so there's an actual discussion going on in the real world off Twitter. On Twitter, there isn't, because everyone's just yelling at each other. And I guess what worries me is that it seems like in certain areas we're moving toward a world where maybe a piece like that wouldn't get published because people would be too worried about the Twitter backlash. I'm aware of some areas where I think things are moving in that direction. That's what worries me. And this isn't something I thought 3 or 4 years ago, because I don't think Twitter and social media were as big then. So I don't think we're there yet. I still think there's this pretty big, thick divide between Twitter and real world publications, but I think it's getting breached a little bit.
So, I mean, Twitter is kind of emblematic of media in general right now, which is that speed is rewards and it destroys. Like, everybody wants to be first to write about a story, to have like the take that will spread like wildfire and be copied a million times, be retweeted, be liked, but without taking a breath, without any like consideration, you can get destroyed by one errant tweet. You could put something up there, delete it 10 minutes later, but it's already, somebody screen grabbed it, somebody's going to use it against you for the rest of your life. So, you know, there isn't much incentive, particularly on Twitter, to stop and take a breath, because once you have, everybody else has already had their take on it.
Yeah, I find that too with, in a little different, you know, level with comedy and putting jokes out there, because, you know, there was a time where I guess comedians were only competing with other comedians as far as getting that joke. Who's going to have that, you know, that great, you know, that late night take on whatever's happening in the news. And now you have professional comedians, but then you also have civilians. Many of them, you know, well, I don't know the percentage of how many of them are actually really funny, but you know, there are people who are not professional comedians who are also able to have a hot take on something, and it's like, oh man, there's that joke. Now nobody can do it.
There's also people who are very, very funny on Twitter who are not funny in real life.
Like whether a lot of comedians.
Yeah, comedians or journalists or media people. They just like, for some reason, the medium works for them on Twitter. They're able to like get a pithy joke off, but if you were in the room with them, they're, you know, wallflowers, or they have no timing. They're just not good comedians.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it also comes down to just having access to people. Like, if you weren't on Twitter, the only access people would have to you would be through, you know, what you write in New York Magazine and that sort of thing. But having you right there, you know, where at any moment they could reach you, is, I think, that could be problematic, you know.
So that, I mean, I was at sort of a permalancer at the Boston Globe's opinion pages around 2010, and occasionally you'd get an unhinged letter to the editor or to you personally. You would ignore it because it was crazy, and there was, you know, if it was crazy, there was no incentive to respond to it. it actually took some effort to sit down and write a letter and send it through snail mail to the editor. Now it's 3 clicks away. Anyone with an opinion, no matter how ill-informed, can get to you. And in one sense, that's good, because journalists haven't always been held accountable, and I do appreciate the fact that I can hear from people, but Twitter's not sending their best and brightest, always, is one way to put it.
Build the wall.
Yeah, exactly. Build the firewall.
Build the firewall.
I'm being honest, 80 to 90% of the stuff I get on Twitter, and you guys have probably experienced this too, you're not hearing from people who have thought this stuff through, because the whole medium incentivizes the quick responses. Whenever people are mad at me online, the ratio in my email inbox or even my DMs is much different. A, it's not as negative, and B, when it is negative, it's thoughtful negative that I can chew over and be like, oh, maybe I did screw this up, maybe I got this wrong, and there's some ability for back and forth. It's just entirely different.
Who'd think email would be the positive force?
That's what's so weird.
Feedback.
I bet 15 years ago people were saying email will destroy our ability to talk in a civil way. Now email is like sitting with like a scroll and a quill pen. Yeah.
Email will save us.
Yeah.
Except Twitter, Twitter actually is an example of, it's not like a Luddite like moral panic. I think it really is like quite disastrous in a way.
I'm being swayed in that direction. Yeah. I'm starting to think that.
I mean, like, just for example, now the long lead into the next election is starting, and if you want to destroy your political opponent, if you write something that is totally brilliantly researched and like devastatingly good and like critiquing some economic policy or something like that, you can write that and it will go down the memory hole basically. But if you can find that they once liked something that could be potentially interpreted by someone as in some way on PC.
An Angela Nagle tweet.
Exactly, yeah, they might have retweeted me at some point. You can destroy them, and it's like 1,000 times more effective. So how can we possibly have any kind of sane or like worthwhile conversation? And the problem is too that, I really like the stuff that you write about. You always seem to be kind of pleading with people to stop this, but I think one of the problems is that people are not going to just put down a weapon that's that effective in the middle of a battle, you know. So nobody on either side, on any side, has any incentive to stop.
Is there a chance though that it might lose its efficacy? Like it feels like maybe I don't know how soon, but I mean, who's safe? You can find that for so many different people, and eventually, if you can do that so frequently at such a rate for anybody, it feels like it would lose its impact
it does,
at some point. And it hasn't quite happened yet, but like I'd like to think, I don't know if it's wishful thinking, that like eventually, they just dug up John Wayne's stuff to like the guy's been dead however long, and like sure it was interesting, but I mean like we can do this all day. There's definitely no shortage of people we could find.
I mean, when the current, online commentariat finds out about Richard Pryor, it's going to be crazy. Like early 70s Richard Pryor.
Right. No, totally.
I think the argument I'm increasingly trying to make to people is you're sort of screwing yourself over in the long run. And this is a subject I shouldn't bring up at all, but Hillary versus Bernie stuff on Twitter, which is, it's reignited. It's the most sort of vicious. It's just awful. And the people engaged in the Hillary-Bernie trenches, just sort of reliving 2016, are so removed from the average American voter and their concerns. Does anyone out in America, is the conversation about Bernie, whether Bernie, on the spectrum of American politics, is racist? Is Bernie really the one upholding the patriarchy or
or is he a Russian asset? That's still going around.
Right. Stuff that, if you told this to normal people, we can swear on this, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you told this to normal people, they'd have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. That is, people are just drowning in this every day, and that's how they view politics. And then, maybe in your own community, that gives you capital, and you can climb to the top of sort of the online left, whatever. But like in the long run, you want to be able to communicate with people about politics in a way they'll understand, and that reflects American reality. And so I try to argue with people, like in the long run, this will wreck you. It will melt your brain. Which it does.
That's an important point, is because almost nobody is actually on Twitter outside of the media, academia, and activism. So it doesn't really represent America, but it does represent the loudest voices that get most amplified in other media off of Twitter. So we kind of mistake like what people actually care about, the things that are actually moving them, with these kind of granular arguments happening between each other.
Yeah, well, we often talk about, moving outside of your bubble, and Twitter is definitely a bubble. Twitter and online, social media. We were talking about this too. Like, when you're able to talk to your parents and they have no idea what you're talking about because they're just not keyed into any of this stuff.
I was in Jersey a couple of weeks ago, and I don't want to say whose, but somebody I know's roommate, and she was wearing one of those face masks that women wear, and I made a joke about blackface, and she didn't know what blackface was.
Oh wow!
Legit, and I like
Did you drag her for that?
No, it would have
got it.
This was one-on-one, and I almost held back my actual surprise because it felt like I would be mean. It would be mean just to even show what my natural reaction to that is. Like, are you kidding me? But she literally did not know what it was, and then I go to my buddy and I was like, she didn't know what. He's like, yeah, dude, she's got like a whatever job. She goes to work. If you brought up Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she doesn't know who that is.
Yeah, she's not running for office in Virginia, so she has no idea what blackface is.
Just totally outside of it, and it's one of those things where like I never know how much to judge exactly what's an actual representation of people, because if the measurement we have is off, like what's the alternative measurement?
I had an amazing moment like that where I was a friend had a bachelor weekend 3 or 4 years ago upstate. At the time, I was getting demolished by Candace Owen fans on Twitter. Long story, I wrote an article about it. She wasn't a fan. I have more perspective now. At the time, it felt serious because you were just getting demolished. She started to change that org petition saying I committed fraud, which is like a crime, because I wrote a mean article about her. I'm with some of my high school friends. We stopped for lunch. And I'm trying to explain this controversy to them in a way they will understand. And they look at me like I just started reciting ancient Greek out of nowhere. They have no idea what I'm talking about. And it was so important to me to realize, like, nobody cares about this.
It's like they don't know the context for the context.
Exactly. Like, I had to start, I was like, do you know who Candace Owens is? And they're like, of course not. I mean, unfortunately, today, that would probably no longer be true. But no one has any idea about this stuff. And I'm blaming myself here, we get obsessed with it because it's so addictive. It's built by evil Silicon Valley bros to addict us, and then we get addicted to it and wonder why other people don't care about it.
Right.
And also, sort of like the situation you described, like how you were, flabbergasted that she didn't know what blackface was. There's sort of, there's this cultural literacy that we're expected to know all these things and also be really offended by all of these things, so that when we meet somebody who doesn't know what it is, like instead of taking a step back, be like, oh, this is my opportunity to explain to you what this, complicated history is and all that.
Right.
This is my chance to put you in your place. I had an experience, I think it was last week, I was at an open mic doing a set. And before I'd done a set, this guy did a set about being married, and he pointed to a young, what looked like a young couple, this boy and this girl, and he said, and they were like, no, that's not us, we're not there. And he's like, well, you should marry your best friend. And it was just really cheesy, whatever. And they're like, haha. When I got up there, like I think it was like 4 or 5 comedians later, I talked about, I'm married, been married for 6 months, and then I pointed at them, and the kid yells out, enough of this heteronormative bullshit. And I'm like, it threw me for a loop, and I'm like, well, hold on a second, I'm only talking to you because it's a callback to what this guy did. So I had to get like meta and explain what a callback is. And it's like, I have no interest in you outside of this guy was talking about weddings, pointed to you guys. You didn't seem to be that upset about it. So now I'm using you as another prop in what I'm doing.
But then they've got all their like background info that they're now seeing that through.
Exactly. It's like, how dare I, come up and say that? And I told the kid, I'm like, look, I just wish you were cuter. More than anything. It's like, if you were cuter, I'd be having a lot more fun up here.
And this is how you discovered Jordan Peterson.
That's right. That's right. I stood up straight with my shoulders
Your hormones,
back.
lobster.
Yeah. But this is the problem, though, because on the one hand, some of what we're saying suggests, or you could conclude from some of it that, this is just the online world. Most people are not interested in it and have no idea it's even going on. All these battles that we think are very important. Isn't it best to just log off, ignore it, that kind of thing? But that's not quite, in my opinion, that's not right either, because somehow this stuff actually does have a broader effect outside. So, so for example, if you say, start planting the idea that, say, Bernie Sanders, old guy, old school leftist, probably doesn't know very much about feminism and stuff like that. He's probably sexist, right? His fans are probably sexist.
Are you planting that right now?
Yeah, I'd never heard that before.
It's just gonna grow.
Well, that was the narrative in 2016, the Bernie bro thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so everyone on Twitter battles that out viciously every day, all day, for God knows how long, and it's just awful. Well, the average person who doesn't know that those battles have gone on will still have a faint version of that filtered through in the general perception, and there's a little bit of no smoke without fire. So it's kind of hard to say exactly, but I think it's, on the one hand, yes, all of our fights online are like absurd. But on the other hand, you can't just ignore them either. Like people say, log off.
In your book, I think you made the good point of keeping an eye on this stuff to understand what's coming around the bend, like especially in the culture, because it does end up sort of like creeping out. Mm-hmm. To move on, to another topic, have any of you thought about in order to improve your image, to orchestrate your own hate crime? Is that a good move now, or is that a no-no? And maybe
it's odd. I mean, I'm not really sure that model ever really worked out.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that appears allegedly to have been the motivating factor in a story you might have heard about in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us about?
I mean, everybody knows about what actor Jussie Smollett from the Fox TV show Empire. I mean, we don't need to break down the whole thing.
Right.
But it was immediately seized upon as almost like an epoch-defining moment. And even President Trump from the Oval Office said it's one of the most horrible things I've ever seen. Because if it was true, it would have been.
Yeah.
But the thing was that everybody, not everybody, but a great many people, including lawmakers and presidential candidates, seized upon it and tried to make it something that is endemic of our times, and that was probably irresponsible, because there wasn't even a moment to vet facts. There wasn't even a moment to vet, to allow the police to do their jobs. It was just, you had to completely seize upon it. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, retweeted somebody or some article that referred to it as an alleged hate crime. And she said, it's not an alleged hate crime, it is a hate crime. And it's like, well, of course it's an alleged hate crime, just like it's an alleged hoax, because we haven't vetted the whole thing yet. It hasn't gone through due process yet. So I wrote a piece for Insider earlier this week, basically calling for due process in the court of public opinion. Now, I know that that's fantastical, and that's not going to happen. That's just not how things work. But I was trying to kind of plant a seed in people's minds to consider it. To consider the idea that you don't know everything right off the bat, that a perfect narrative is almost certainly not going to be perfect, and that you will probably do more damage than good if you immediately, hyperbolically seize upon it. And if you are an influencer, whether you're a celebrity or worse, a lawmaker or presidential candidate, you really do have a responsibility to take a deep breath, allow the facts to be vetted before you clamp down on a narrative that sort of impugns half the country.
Mm-hmm. It's weird because there seemed to be so little repercussions. Like it felt like when it first broke, you had people on the left, like you said, who were immediately, outraged about it. You have people on the right who also, without all the information, very early on were like vocally skeptical about it. And now, whichever way it turns out, now that it turned out that it was a hoax, everyone's just quiet. There's very little repercussion, it feels like, whether in the court of public opinion or in any other context, for anybody who stood behind it fully before we had the information. But also, if it went the other way, there's probably, everybody stays to the people they agree with. Everyone stays to the people they agree with. You have your right-wing podcasts that'll continue,
principles are in short supply. This is not a left-wing or right-wing
What's the incentive? Like, what's the incentive for actually having some accountability and responsibility?
It's similar to Covington, where after the story got more complicated, there was very little like, sorry, I got this wrong. I should have been more careful. People just sort of plow on to the next thing, which in the long run is really dangerous. Like whatever your own politics, whatever you think of this stuff, because people can really exploit this kind of instant maximalist outrage thing. I mean, in the case of Covington, there was that weird account that started the whole thing. We don't know what their motives were, why they did it, and it's just people are asking to get burned again and again.
In this case, at least, it felt like the media updated the story as more information went in.
Yeah.
I didn't see that very much at all with Covington.
Yeah, the thing about Covington, like, now that it's been a month and it's a forgotten story, and it basically ended the moment Nathan Phillips was revealed to have lied about his Vietnam service, that he was actually in the Marines, but he never deployed. So that was basically when people just lost interest. That was when media lost interest. But now that it's been a month, imagine that same thing happened with no cameras. It's nothing. It is literally nothing. Nothing happened. A bunch of perhaps obnoxious kids wearing MAGA hats who were at a pro-life rally were getting heckled and were heckling back at a racist religious cult, and a Native American man came over and started banging the drum in front of a child's face.
His drumming wasn't even that good.
So
that was my main
it's
critique.
literally nothing. It's just there was no violence. There were really no threats.
But there was no story.
Yeah, but when you've got a couple of camera phones, zeroing in on a few things that trigger people's hotspots, then it becomes a story. But nothing happened at all.
Yeah, and it's really upsetting, the idea that we need to put all this weight and attention on these nothings that happen because they happen to feed into whatever worldview we have. We're like, ooh, I could use this. This is great. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is Trump's America, or this is the left against free speech or something like that.
And well, then that's the thing. It's not just to get attention. There's this weird system set up where like the most irresponsible voices on every side can latch onto every single one and say, this proves that what I've been saying all along is true. And then when it turns out, well, it doesn't prove that, because it was they just move on to the next thing. And it's this question of like gatekeeping, where there were serious problems with old school journalism, and it wasn't inclusive, and it didn't tell all these stories, but people had, for the most part, had to follow certain norms, or at least in a certain circumscribed way. Now it really is the Wild West, and I don't know, I feel like we've missed a chance for some kind of balance, where we open things up and allow more voices in, but still keep certain principles in
It's
play.
interesting. The Wild West kind of is now leading the mainstream.
Yeah.
So instead of
Absolutely.
perhaps fringe cultures following the mainstream's gatekeepers' leads, it's the opposite. Like a random account from overseas who we don't know who it was posts this completely out of context clip, and everybody like catnip runs to it, and then the story takes over the whole country for a week and a half.
It was me, by the way. I should. That was my account.
I was trying to explain to a Czech journalist that, because this had just happened, the Covington thing, and I was saying, it's complicated. This boy, he smiled in a way that people, I just couldn't explain it,
And then he was like, my people haven't smiled in so long. What can that be?
Right. He smiled weird? Was he thinking of his like relative who'd been run over by a tank by the Soviets?
Well, also I think that there's something. It makes me so happy when I see people who admit when they have been wrong, and I don't think we give that enough currency. And as somebody who has been wrong, is probably going to be wrong for the the next half hour or so, however long we're here. I just think it's so important to be able to say like, hey, I got it wrong. I'll try to do better next time. But it's almost getting it wrong is another dig that somebody else could have on you, and that it's sort of like tantamount to lying about something, or in a way it's even worse.
So one Twitter practice that I kind of like, and I try to do it myself, but it gets you no Twitter currency, is when you get something wrong, screen grab your wrong tweet, say I deleted because it was wrong, and I don't want it to be retweeted and liked and further disseminated, and here's what I got wrong, and mea culpa. That doesn't get you any pats on the back. It doesn't get you any kudos. Nobody's like, that's a journalist with integrity. But it's still the right thing to do.
It's crazy people don't do that. Yeah. They'll sometimes correct, but leave the old, much more viral tweet up. Which, how? How can you do that?
Yeah, but I mean, one of the problems too in this is that social media also really disincentivizes being the person to say, I'm not sure about this. This doesn't quite sound right. Like that, you basically, that's because what happens then is people say, "Oh, why are you defending? Why are you being defensive about this?" So even like the thing you did with like, "Don't make me defend Donald Trump." It's that kind of thing. It's like, no, but what you're saying is like clearly doesn't even make sense. So that's just why I'm criticizing it. But if you do that, the reaction you get, you may as well come out and say whatever like very extreme opinion they're fantasizing that you have.
It kind of makes sense emotionally, like it's almost like they're outsourcing confidence, where if it sounds like you have a nuanced opinion,
there's doubt there.
There's doubt there, and it's also like when somebody else is having a conversation, if they don't want to think about it too clearly, it's really easy to just like have a firm stance on like this particular thing. And so if they could just quote or retweet somebody else who has a non-nuanced but like loud, firm, it makes sense. It's the same way in like comedy. You can have brilliant jokes, but if you're not comfortable or like confident on stage, nobody enjoys it because they're just empathizing with the fact that you're not confident, you know? And so it's the same thing with Twitter, where it feels like they just want to feel, they want to like vicariously feel what it feels like to be so sure and locked in your stance.
It's almost like either jockey high school boys in a locker room or like baboons or some other primate, where if you exhibit any sign of weakness, someone's just going to like seize on it. So admitting you're wrong or admitting you think something has nuance to it, like that someone will use that against you. They'll weaponize it. I mean, but just to inject a little bit of a silver lining here, I have found as these sort of online culture wars have gotten more intense, there is something of an audience for people who are exhausted by this, even on Twitter, which is crazy. Something of an audience for people who are tired of this and want journalists and public figures to say that kind of thing. Like, I'm not sure, let's chill out. I think that audience might be dwarfed by crazy people who want the maximalist approach, but they're there. Like, I hear from them.
They're listening to podcasts.
They're watching this.
Well, also, I think something, an element of it might be that there seems to be no forgiveness nowadays. So if you do make a mistake, well, you're not going to be forgiven even if you apologize for it. And I would really love to get to a point where we are, a little bit more forgiving of one another. I feel like this is all about me. I really just want you guys to forgive me for everything that I'm doing wrong. I really need that.
Also, if we could lay off on like beards and stuff.
Yeah.
Like your beard for all of us.
Yeah, and if my wife can just, take me back. But I think we. I was talking earlier in the green room with a couple of guys about it. The idea of, people are cheering when careers are ended. Like you make that one mistake and your career is ended. And it's happening from both sides where, you have big name people like Roseanne who, ends up losing her show. But then on the smaller level, you have, say people who are working in a vape shop who, go batshit crazy over a Trump supporter who comes in. They get filmed, they look ridiculous, and they're fired, they lose their job. Where, you know what, you could laugh at that and applaud that, like, yeah, he lost his job, but I would much rather us live in a world where that guy can be taken aside and be shown why what he did was wrong, terrible customer service, but there's a chance that he can be redeemed and like, hey, I'm sorry I did that, I was out of line, I've learned from this, I won't do it again, I'm going to treat people better. And when that option isn't there, I feel like it's just going to lead to a little bit more madness.
Well, it's like antithetical to a liberal concept of a justice system, right? Eventually, if your goal is for somebody to lose their livelihood, what's the alternative? Either they end up on the streets, or we have some sort of way of getting people back to the place where they're contributing to society again.
We'll have to have a rehab program for
people who freak out in viral video.
Twitter jail.
Well, it's also just like it's not sustainable in a country of whatever up to now, 350, 330 million
and
people.
We're going to get into that when we talk about migration and immigration.
It's just not sustainable. People disagree about shit. They're going to disagree about stuff, and you have to sort of, swallow your pride or swallow your outrage and allow people to have a relatively broad swath of opinions and to sometimes freak out and sometimes be jerks without it ruining their lives. Because if not, this stuff will just escalate and there's no incentive to sort of calm down and claw it back.
Nice. Well, I think we're done here.
Exactly.
I'd love this opportunity to talk about a very divisive topic, which is immigration. And I feel like the narrative surrounding immigration, it's making it like almost impossible to have a fruitful discussion about it. And Jesse mentioned your article, the left case against open borders. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think what I was really thinking at the time was that it seemed to me like the taboo around the subject was moving at a pace in this kind of like not Trump reactiveness, right? So whatever Trump is doing, you have to, how you find the correct position is to find the exact opposite one. Seems to be the way that people like figure out what's like a woke opinion. And you know, but then I was thinking like at what point did a range of opinion where you normally find people who are really social democrats, right? So people who believe that we should have tax redistribution of wealth, and that the government should play a significant role in I guess kind of not planning the economy, but in infrastructure, in public services, and all kinds of stuff like that. So in other words, implicitly they believe that the state has a significant role in the economy, but at the same time they were somehow drifting to this what I consider to be like quite a radical libertarian position on borders. Now, borders, not necessarily physical, but at least legal, or are a definitional fact of a nation state. And so, if you want to make the case against them, you have to kind of make a coherent anarchist libertarian case, I think. So you can't be a social democrat and be truly libertarian on open borders. So really what I wanted to do is kind of call attention to the fact that this taboo was emerging that made a kind of a nonsensical position from the left, and that one of the things that I really thought too was that this is going to cause problems for the left down the road, because if they're making this a taboo, then what's going to happen when Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders or whoever, people who really articulated exactly the same position as me in that piece, start to get close to power? Are they going to be then taken down by their own side?
One of the things I wanted to talk about was the history of the left, and especially workers' unions and their relationship to mass migration. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that's changed.
Well, I would say up until pretty recently, the majority of the left, there were always like advocates for open borders, and there were more like anarchist politics within the left too. But I'd say the majority of the left up until very recently, generally took the view that employers can, one of the reasons that business tends to be very pro-migration is because it means they can import low-wage labor, and that they
drive down the cost of labor.
Exactly, and so if business can find a very large pool of people who they can replace workers with, they want to do that. On the higher end, then you also have the kind of movement of a professional class into the kind of imperial centers of the world. So I talk about, for example, doctors, moving from the third world to big cities in Britain and America.
You're saying I think the line was that there were more Ethiopian doctors.
Somali doctors.
So is it Somali doctors in
Chicago
than there is in the actual country
in
itself?
Somalia? Yeah. So that's a problem, and one of the reasons I kind of had this perspective is that I was born in America. My parents were immigrants, but I spent most of my life in Ireland. So.
Were you born? I didn't know you were born in the States.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I saw it kind of from both sides, because Ireland has had a chronic problem with outward migration for 200 years. Mm-hmm. And it is a real problem. Smaller countries, developing countries, often through public wealth, train their own engineers, their own doctors and so on, and they all just leave. And that's a huge problem. There's all kinds of problems like that are just not being talked about in any way, because if you try to discuss the issue and you're doing it in any kind of serious way, you will eventually run up against the fact that you have to either defend the existence of nation states or take a radical libertarian position.
What I find interesting is there's nothing that you said there that I don't think does not merit a conversation or a rebuttal or something like that. Whereas I feel like with immigration, especially now, it's if you bring up those kinds of questions, then it's automatically, well, you must be against immigration because you're a racist, And it was interesting reading about, a very famous workers' rights, unionizer, which was Cesar Chavez, who was a Chicano American,
Anti-immigration,
to the point where I've always said, I read stories about them, beating up migrants who were coming over the border because they were competition. What are you guys? Where are you guys on the immigration?
On beating up migrants.
Beating up migrants. How many could you beat up?
Let's make the most painfully out of context clip that could possibly be used to destroy everybody in this room.
I feel like it's not a subject I know enough about to have a really informed opinion, but I was interested in your thesis that the sorts of people who make these arguments are sort of elite, more upper middle class and above, and to the extent there's an effect on labor and wages, it's at the bottom end. And it's not someone like me who would have to deal with that. It's sort of the sorts of people you don't see in journalism as much. I mean, do I have that right? That it's sort of
I'm just imagining like a bunch of like Jesse Singles outside of Home Depot, just waiting to get picked up for
their takes.
But some daily takes.
But even on the other side, they might benefit from it as far as the cost of goods going down and things like that.
Oh yeah, she mentioned like driver. I mean, we benefit in a lot of ways. If we're those of us who are relatively comfortable economically, I mean, isn't that sort of your thesis, right? We benefit in a lot of ways from immigration. But you're saying it's lower wage people more likely to be hurt by it?
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of is an effect of globalization. It destabilizes different economies in different ways. So like the example also being the problem with developing countries and smaller countries not being able to have a professional class. I mean, I start off with this like reference to the Berlin Wall, because
which was built with migrant labor.
Well, so in the East German like economic experiment, if you like, they had to physically keep people in because they planned their economy and they said we need this many engineers. So it's just interesting now that the assumed left position is in such stark contrast. The assumed left position would say every socialist state that has ever existed is like a horrifying Nazi experiment, basically. Every socialist state that's ever existed is right-wing, but my position, which we took up at some point maybe 2 years ago, is the left-wing one.
Wait, the socialist state would be the...
because what there's
the fascist element.
Oh,
yeah,
okay, I got it.
So in other words, so if you're saying the assertion of the right of nation states to exist at all and to have any borders at all is right wing, well then how do you explain Cuba or East Germany or any number of nation states which actually often did have kind of nationalist components to them? I mean, so to make that the new position that everyone must now adopt without having had any discussion about it just doesn't make any sense.
Without Trump, it probably doesn't happen because Trump's rhetoric makes it the left needs to kind of reflexively say, no, that's wrong and it's immoral, even though their own political preferences, like you said, just a couple of years ago, were for strict immigration enforcement to preserve the social welfare state. I'm not, economics is not something that I delve tremendously into. I'm more of the lowercase civil libertarian type.
Sure.
So I generally am more comfortable with much greater increased legal immigration, but not total open borders, that it should be managed, and that I do think that overall, it's obvious that like in certain pockets, short term, lower income people or lower wage workers might feel negative benefits of increased immigration in their communities. But immigrants do come here and within less than a generation are building new businesses, creating new communities.
Making people.
Like
my dad usually came here and made me.
Factually committing less crime.
Coming in and making white people.
And the thing is, and unlike, again, every single generation thinks they're the first one to experience, immigration demographic changes. But even now, just like they were 100 years ago when, you'd see political cartoons of Italians landing on the shores with knives in their teeth, the immigrants are learning English and assimilating at the exact same rates as they've done for the last 100 years.
And I think when it comes to, I would love to see more of a discussion of what the actual policies look like. So if you are, an open borders person, okay, well, what does that policy, look like on a day-to-day basis? What if you are, closed borders? What does that policy look like? And it seems like policy discussion is, giving way to ideas like, no person is illegal, and it's like, well, what is that? I don't even know what that means necessarily.
I feel like there's two things going on. One is, correct me if I'm wrong, but your argument was like, this is what the left's stance on immigration, migration should be, which is a totally fair thing to write about. Then there's the fact that the guy making our current immigration policy is Stephen Miller, which is sort of a short-term nightmare that we need to deal with because that's terrible. And there's been horribly inhumane policies. So I feel like people sometimes mix up those two discussions and act like if you make an argument like Angela made, you're somehow not serious about the threat Stephen Miller posed to human
It almost
decency.
helps him, though, because, right, he's crafting this stuff, and the response a lot of times is just a very heightened emotional response where kind of the reason people get so mad and worked up about it is almost to avoid thinking about the complexity of, like, how do you actually solve this thing? Where, like, it's really, even just from a liberal standpoint, like you said, if you're trying to have any kind of, like, universal basic income or social welfare system, how do you do that with open borders? Do you do that for the whole world now? Like, how does that, if they ever had universal basic income and you open up borders in the country, you're paying for income for the whole world now.
And ideas too of is it necessarily a road to citizenship? Are you allowed to vote?
It's just super complicated, and it's a lot easier to just go dial up the emotional state and be anti something than for a very specific, legislation.
Yeah. And how do you think this sort of fits into the idea of the declaration of a state of emergency when it comes to the wall?
I think it's comical.
full of shit, yeah.
It's outrageous. It's principled Republicans are not for it. And it's going to be used by Democrats who will inevitably be in office one day, and they will be using it to enact policies that they can't get through Congress.
Forced gay marriage, for example.
There you go.
I'm already married, guys, so maybe down the road. And I wonder, if we're here, I want us all to figure out, the immigration debate.
We can do it.
Well, we can do it.
5 more minutes?
We didn't even have a watch. We both looked at our wrists. There were no watches there. This is a learned behavior. Somebody's putting this in our head. But I wonder, what does the ideal compromise, look like at this point,
Well, I should say, my piece was not like a policy proposal, you know what I mean? And the fact that the people are not having the conversation means kind of very elementary points, were really what I was bringing out, which was the question of, if you accept the nation state exists, then you must accept borders, legal or physical or of some kind, exist. And if you accept the idea of citizenship and rights that a citizen has and so on, then, at some point you are basically agreeing implicitly that there has to be some restriction on movement of some kind. So in other words, you can't take a totally morally pure position if this is the taboo. And so no discussion of it is possible. So, basically I think most people accept that that you should be able to become a citizen at some point, and how exactly you measure that is going to be a matter of kind of quite technical disagreement. It's not going to be a big moral battle where there's like good and evil. It's going to be quite technical, and in many ways one of the reasons I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of that stuff is because I would defer to people who are really expert on what exactly happens when you enforce different policies, looking around the world at how is it played out, that kind of thing. So I really just wanted to make that elementary point and start a debate, which didn't really work.
And I was actually happy, like I say, I've read some rebuttals to your work, and it was nice to see that it was actually taking on your arguments and what you were saying. There was the idea of freedom of movement, and whether if that is a universal right, then how does that meet up against closed borders? And that's a interesting conversation to be had on it for sure.
Well, another thing that needs to be talked about too is like one of the causes of it. So for example, right after the article came out, Hillary Clinton said something like Europe should have take in more refugees or something like this, have more liberalized immigration policies.
I think we should make more refugees.
We're good at that.
So does Hillary Clinton. This is the problem. I mean, like the kind of policies that she has advocated in the Middle East and Libya and elsewhere are part of the cause of why there is a migrant crisis in Europe. And so the thing is, like, if you're not going to address those problems, in order to address those problems, you have to accept that this is a problem in the first place. But if you make it taboo to even suggest that there is a problem, if you say, well, what's wrong with the fact that there are, very large numbers of people moving, and coming to Europe.
Mostly men, too.
In very dangerous conditions and so on. But if you can't even address the idea that there's actually something really fundamentally wrong with this picture, and we shouldn't just be celebrating it as a great freedom, we should actually be looking at stopping the root causes of it. So, one of the things I said, I went on Tucker Carlson's show.
You did? I hadn't heard about
yes,
that.
I did. Oh, amazing. Amazing you didn't. One of the things I tried to say in a very, very short space of time that you have is that, America, like any other nation, should, in my opinion, have the right to have the sovereignty of its national borders, but it must respect the sovereignty of other nations' national borders. That means no meddling in the economic affairs of other countries, particularly in Latin America, and it means no military interventions in the Middle East or anywhere else. And we would solve, this wouldn't be a crisis if we did that, I think.
And I think that's obviously, foreign policy is another huge topic. And even that, you have the complexity of, sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, especially when you have, pretty horrific regimes in all these countries where I need to kind of take a step back. And
I will say, one of my hopes is that 20 or 30 years from now, it's viewed as a moral abomination how few Middle Eastern refugees we took, given our contribution to what happened over there and how much we've screwed up that region. You just look at the numbers. Germany took 1 million, more than 1 million. Sweden, I just don't. I know it's complicated and it requires open discussion, and it isn't always easy to take in refugees. There's some level of stress there, but I just think the U.S. really, this is pre-Trump too, we didn't pull our weight. I think we really bear some moral responsibility here, and we just haven't done.
Are you just looking for a roommate?
I'm looking for a roommate.
Particularly with Libya, we had. Reports on what went wrong in Iraq and where the intelligence led people to advocate for an invasion. We didn't do that over Libya. The UK did. The UK had a report that basically came to almost exactly similar conclusions to Iraq, which was that information was cherry-picked to come to the conclusion that an invasion was absolutely necessary. Not an invasion, but supporting the destabilization and ousting of Gaddafi. And that there was no plan for afterwards. So the fact that I completely agree with you that we played such a great role in destabilizing Libya and the surrounding countries, and basically created a haven for ISIS and Al Qaeda where there was none before, but did nothing to restabilize the country or take in refugees,
it up, yeah.
Or help European nations manage the refugee crisis as well.
Stories old as time.
Power vacuums. We're all about it. Well, moving on to the end of the world. Let's talk about the Green New Deal. Right? I guess it's sort of the Anthony. You've written about it a little bit, in particular the rollout. Of the Green New Deal.
I'm probably more expert on the rollout of it as a political observer than I am about environmental issues or the feasibility or the affordability of anything going on The main thing to remember is that the Green New Deal is not legislation. It's a roadmap for future legislation. It's a bunch of plans with end goals. Some of those end goals just do not seem realistic, like the end of the internal combustion engine within 10 years. Just don't see it. I don't know how you'd incentivize that. I don't know how you'd make that happen. But the thing that was, from a media standpoint, a little odd to me was how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's team put up a frequently asked questions document to their own website and then disseminated it to several major media outlets, including the NPR and the Washington Post. And when they got criticism for one line in particular about subsidizing people unwilling to work, they pulled the document, and then sent surrogates around to kind of fudge the issue, to confuse the issue. That saying on one hand, the document was uploaded accidentally, that it was just a draft, and on the other hand, that document never existed. It was a right-wing troll thing going around because there was like
was the cow farts? Was that a legit thing?
Cow farts was legit.
That was legit.
Yes, but that it wasn't in that document. It wasn't there were draft documents that were legit that were not the ones uploaded to the website. There was another one that was just an obvious parody that was ridiculous. And the thing that we were talking about before about like correcting the record. So one of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's surrogates is a Cornell professor. His name escapes me right now. He was on Tucker Carlson's show, and he was the one saying, "Oh, that's a right-wing troll job. It just doesn't exist." And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez retweeted that clip, and that clip is still on her Twitter feed right now, and she knows that that's not true, and she knows like that's not even the narrative her office is putting out right now. So I don't mention all this stuff to judge the merits of the Green New Deal on it, but I think it does say something about the deal itself, that the rollout was so confused. Could it be possible that the stuff in the proposal itself was a little not well thought out?
This is a question that might just be like a little tangential. Since she's a congressperson, is she allowed to delete tweets, or are those sort of like public records? I remember a little while back there was a question over whether or not Trump was allowed to delete his tweets.
Well, he does delete tweets.
He does.
Like there's been typos that have been deleted. I know that CNN has some kind of thing that captures every Trump tweet so that it can't possibly ever be flushed down the memory hole. I don't think there's rules applying to congresspeople.
I think there's a Presidential Records Act issue if there's an issue there.
Okay.
I mean, I guess if you guys give me 30 seconds at the end, I'll give you my alternative to the internal combustion engine. But setting that aside, politically, what sort of, first of all, we obviously need something like this. We need someone to take climate change seriously, and every past attempt on the part of American politicians has failed, sometimes by sort of agonizingly narrow margins. There was this lefty thing where you try to do everything at once in there. You're including stuff about education, about housing, a lot of policies that I'm in favor of in one way or another, but there's always this tendency where it can never just be about the thing itself. There's climate march stuff that brings Israel into it. There's Black Lives Matter stuff that brings other issues into it. And especially for something like climate change, where by definition you're calling for policies that will hurt some people.
Right.
It will hurt powerful people. To me, the last thing you want to do is sort of load it down with other not quite related stuff. Because then you're drawing in the people who are also opposed to whatever housing issue you're proposing, or this. And that struck me as, I understand why it fires up the base, but getting something like this through Congress, it's not just about your base.
I remember a while back there was this article in Rolling Stone about an astrologist who was combining social justice and astrology. And it was like, I don't know who you're winning over.
It's almost like he was against social justice, or I don't remember if it was a man or a woman. But
it was a woman.
If you really want to shit on social justice, add astrology to it, or another thing that makes everyone sound crazy.
Exactly. Whereas getting into actual discussions again about what does this look like? What impact will coming off of fossil fuels have on energy prices?
And how will alchemy affect it?
Yeah, just this idea, it's usually phrased something like all forms of oppression are connected. That drives me crazy.
Well, when you write it, it is.
Right.
It's right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the words.
You're just stating it as a fact.
Yeah.
That general attitude, that's not true.
No, and I agree with it. I think we are playing with our future by not addressing climate change, and there absolutely does need some responsible legislation needs to be put forth. But by putting literally the entire cabinet of social issues that would also require a major realignment of how we live our lives. It's just you're going to confuse the issue, and you're going to drive a wedge between people who might have been receptive to the idea of making sacrifices on the climate issue.
Do you think the fact that the left in the U.S. is politically so weak and has been for so long, despite this sort of post-Trump AOC and stuff. Sorry, I'm like now asking questions.
Oh, no.
Do you think that, people who have been kept out of power for a long time, do you think that contributes to a certain lack of what it means to actually come up with a deal without loading it down with every item on the wish list?
Well, I mean, within the last decade, Democrats controlled Congress and the White House, and the environment has been an issue before. But that, at the time, Obamacare was the big thing that they put all their chips on the table for that.
Right.
So I'm not blaming them for that. They made their choice of what thing they wanted to prioritize was, and healthcare is an important thing to prioritize.
Right.
But the thing about it is we always say all politics is local. It's a big deal. Like we could pass a whole lot of stuff in Congress, and if you can't get the states to go along with it, a lot of states replicated California's emission laws. A lot of states defiantly would not. And so unless that's a problem with our federalist system. 50 states and D.C. and all the territories. If because the federal government doesn't have the ability to throw a blanket on all that stuff, I don't know exactly how even a unified Democratic Party that is ascendant can make all those things happen at once. You might have to pick one thing and then pick another thing.
I suspect, I could be wrong about this, but I suspect that one of the reasons that they've done all of this together and framed it as a Green New Deal is that the last time there was a very powerful and popular kind of environmentalist movement, there was a kind of a backlash against it and a critique of it, which saw it as a kind of green austerity, that it would raise taxes on people who don't earn very much. If you look at, say, the yellow vests in France, that it would cause a backlash like that, like a working class backlash.
It's like a regressive tax.
Yeah, and that it would be something that only elites kind of approved of, and that, so for example, what about people who work in those industries that would be shut down, coal miners and stuff like that. So I think that their idea was, is appealing in a way, in that it's kind of reframing it as we can solve the green issues, but we can also actually, reboot the economy through investment and stuff like that. So it's appealing in that way that it wouldn't have been before. I think that was their way of kind of solving that.
I think people also will look at an issue like energy dependent upon where they are geographically. It's tough to, if you take someone who lives in like Santa Monica, like California, and compare them to someone who lives in, Pennsylvania, during the winter. Right. It's sort of like you definitely have different needs, and there's gonna, obviously be a different kind of output depending on what kind of alternative fuel source that you would come up with. Boris shared with me that article in Forbes in regards to Vermont, when Vermont shut down one of their nuclear power plants, and actually, I think emissions went up or something like that.
Well, that's also because in this there's also no room for nuclear, I think, from what I read in the Green New Deal either, which is a weird. I'm no expert on energy, but it seems like it's one of the more realistic alternatives.
It's one of the cleanest forms of energy as long as nothing goes wrong.
Right. Well, it's also kind of a weird self-defeating thing where a lot of our nuclear facilities aren't as well funded or up to date. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that a lot of the anti-nuclear mentality feeds into the problems with nuclear.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'd like to move on to the last topic I'd like to talk about. And you brought up the idea of the local has become national, and I think we saw an example of that over the past few weeks with the Amazon deal going south in Long Island City, and you actually live in Long Island City, so maybe you can talk about that.
I mean, there was Amazon was kind of dangling the idea that they were going to put a second headquarters in another American city. So cities were vying for them to come. And in doing so, gave Amazon so much data about their communities and their businesses. Kind of brilliant Machiavellian move. I was in Cincinnati a year and a half ago for a baseball weekend, and there were signs saying "Come Amazon." I guess it was a big local civic thing. And so I don't remember how many months ago it was, but Amazon said, okay, we're going to come to this town just on the other side of the river from DC and Long Island City. And in the place in Long Island City where the Amazon headquarters was going to go, it's not, nobody lives there. And there's actually very few businesses there. It's kind of a rundown, formerly industrial area so in that sense, it always bugs me when I see businesses coming in and using eminent domain and kicking people out of their homes and kicking businesses out. It didn't seem like that was happening here. It did bug me that they were getting ridiculous tax incentives that they didn't need. And clearly, since they pulled out, they've demonstrated that they didn't need it. But I did think that the idea, and it was interesting that Queens residents and union workers, it was very popular. It was actually far more popular in Queens and among the working class than it was in Manhattan. So I got mixed feelings about it. It would have helped my property values. Long Island City is an improving area. This might have complicated things. It might have made certain things better if they actually went through with the promise that they had made, which was to invest a ton of money in infrastructure. That would have been a good thing in the long run, although I'm always suspicious of those kinds of things because the enforcement mechanisms are usually weak, and the politicians who sign those deals will be long out of office by the time the check clears. So I think that catches us up, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I own Amazon. And, oh man,
disclosure.
So I wonder, again, coming to this idea of narratives, depending on which side you were on, seemingly it's like either you were a winner or a loser. So the winners were, AOC and people who were against, gentrification, and people who were like, yeah, screw the billionaires and all that. And the losers seem to be, politicians like Cuomo and I was going to say Pataki. He hasn't been governor in a really long time. And De Blasio, these people who are trying to do this, make this deal work. And then also there were locals like yourself, and there were people planning on having businesses around this to cater to
people who bought real estate, jumped onto it at that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, the combination of Amazon coming and the L train going down. Because Long Island City and Astoria are adjacent. They're just right over the Newtown Creek from Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So everybody was kind of migrating north anyway. And now the L train's not going down, and Amazon's not coming.
There's got to be someone who sold their place there and then bought one in LIC.
Yeah.
That was interesting to me that there had been local polling suggesting people support it, because I felt like that wasn't reflected in the coverage I saw. It was very much like AOC and lefties against it, more billionaire-friendly liberals and to the right were for it. I don't think coverage always captures the true nuance.
Yeah, I mean, it was a loud minority, and politicians who were representing that voice were the ones heard. And who knows what the real thing? Amazon says it was local politicians not willing to come to the table that made them feel like it wasn't worth it. Who knows?
It's interesting to me when people say, I heard this a lot because I listen to the Daily Times podcast, when people say
don't plug anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I heard it on We the Internet.
Thank you.
When people say things like they didn't need the tax breaks or the subsidies, it's like, well, yeah, but the whole point is they think they can force cities to compete for it.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of need; it's a matter they can take. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to. I was really interested in you have AOC. She's new in Congress, and it's sort of like on the local level, it's like, do people know how these business deals are made on the local level? And I feel like there's such an ignorance there. The idea of I do not support subsidies and the like, but how does this deal compare to other deals that were made in the city? Is it so crazy that this deal was sort of drawn up the way it was?
A big misconception is the idea that these tax breaks represent real money that could be spent on something else. It's not how it works.
Right.
And it'd be great if there was $3 billion to fix the subways. It was just yesterday in Woodside, a plank from a rotting piece of wood impaled a car and nearly killed somebody. This is the richest city in the richest country in the world, and we have a embarrassment of a infrastructure system. So that's why I said, if it was true, if true, if Amazon actually was going to invest in infrastructure, it would have been a long-term win. But AOC in particular and a lot of local politicians kind of are conflating tax breaks with funny money that actually exists.
But also, a lot of these companies, Silicon Valley seems to be particularly bad for this, are able to not just make cities compete, but the whole world has to compete for them, you know. So Ireland, for example, is, I mean, effectively a tax haven at this point.
Right.
Ireland has the European headquarters of every major tech company, pretty much. And of course, the government always say, you know, try to flatter people and say it's because we're so great. That's why they want to be
Everybody
here.
loves the Irish.
The Delaware of the EU.
But of course, it's because they pay effectively almost no tax. And we have really low corporation tax anyway, but we've also got so many loopholes that a lot of these companies will just set up an office and run all their finances through that. And they're not even employing that many people.
So they're basically Delaware? Because that's what everyone's saying. Everyone sets up shop.
But here's the problem, though. If you do the AOC thing, the equivalent, and you say these companies aren't paying any tax, you know, Apple is paying like 0.02 or something, then what the other side will say, right, but if we try to make them, they'll leave, which is true, they might. And so they kind of have everyone by the balls. Am I allowed to say that?
Sure.
That they force the entire world to compete for them. And there's not, you know, it is true what they say, that if you actually ask them to do anything, they'll just go to the next bidder.
I guess it is the reality of incentives, and you know what is going to be, you know, what is going to incentivize a company to come here. And Kevin Williamson, who writes for National Review, in his piece, he wrote about, you know, sort of this. The complexity or you know, the oxymoronic nature of New York City, you know, politics, where he says, you know, bribing Amazon to choose New York City on the one hand, threatening businesses and their high income executives with punitive regulation and confiscatory taxes on the other. You know, that's New York City, where, you know, hey, come over here, but again, you're an evil billionaire, you know, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you pay, you know, your fair share. Whereas the idea, I think the idea would be, you know, be the type of city that companies are clamoring to build in, you know, because it's sort of like, yeah, this Amazon deal went south. Where are the other companies who are coming in and be like, hey, we'll
But do you think there's any shortage of companies that want New York office? I mean, does New York face any challenges on that front?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Because all we're, you know, talking about, well, you know, it's you know, still what they do is Amazon.
It's also sort of a leverage thing, that once you have a company that can, it's large enough to compete and leverage with entire nations. That's sort of just the reality of it. Is if you had two nations that were competing, you know, over something, it would be the same thing. It would be military power or whatever else. Amazon has the financial power of a full nation, so they have enough leverage to make a bunch of nations compete over them.
I wish there was a way, I'm just going to venture into an area I know nothing about, but I imagine hypothetically...
Follow my lead?
Hypothetically, there's got to be, you could pass a federal law limiting what sorts of, I guess it would be like a federalism issue, but limiting what sorts of incentives you can offer to a company. Like, are you allowed to say you don't have to pay X in taxes? But if you change the rules, at least you could somehow maybe hypothetically address it within the US, he said.
Right,
Not
but
sure
then once we're global, they'll find, you know, they'll go to the other side of the world if they need to.
Yeah,
So,
and it, you know, it's interesting, and you know, on the local level, you know, how many, you know, high tax paying former citizens of New York, residents of New York, have moved, you know, to Florida and that sort of thing. And you know, it's the reality of when you have, you know, sort of this technocratic idea of like, well, you know, we could raise this, you know, we'll raise this over here and lower this over there. It's going to have a big impact on people, especially when people do have the ability to move and to migrate and all that. I think we've been at this for a little while. I hope you guys have enjoyed the conversation. Before we go, any last words? We're going to live after this.
what didn't you tell us about this video?
Any final words?
No, I'm just everybody subscribe to the Fifth Column podcast and read Insider, particularly the politics section.
Yell at me on Twitter. Tell me I'm a terrible person. That's my thing. I love it.
I'm avoiding Twitter and everything like that, so nobody can reach me.
At the Boris K on all social media. And if you're watching live on Wednesday, I have a show with Richard Kind on it at the Red Room. Check out my social media for info.
In New York City.
In New York City.
And guys, once again, I'm Lou Perez with We the Internet TV. Please subscribe, share our videos, and check us out and let us know what you think about this episode. We have another one coming at the end of next month, March. We're going to be talking about gun rights and their impact on marginalized communities. Should be fun.